Bienvenue and welcome to stormy Southwest France from the Atelier Mélusine, our small gallery in Southwest France, and to the opening weekend of the Scarlet Woman project events. We're starting with a series of dialogical events, and this afternoon I'm delighted to welcome an illustrious panel which will be moderated by Manon Hedenborg. The conference theme today is Scarlet Woman in Esotericism and the Artistic Culture from the Fin-de-Siècle until today. This roundtable takes as its starting point the ways in which the Scarlet Woman, up until the 19th century, connoting a prostitute or sexually immoral woman, has been reinterpreted as an esoteric office, especially within Aleister Crowley's religion Thelema and among its later adherents. Bringing together a panel of experts on Western esotericism and the artistic occulture, this roundtable explores the shifting meaning of the Scarlet Woman in the intersecting spheres of esoteric and artistic expression from the earlier 20th century until today, in relation to changing states of femininity, magic, and transgression during this time. And I'm going to hand over to our lovely moderator, Manon Hedenborg.
Thank you so much, Sally, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to our illustrious panelists for being here. And thank you also to our guests, those of you who have tuned into the Zoom room to be here with us today, and also those who have joined us in our live audience here in the Atelier. It's absolutely wonderful to see you all. And I'm so honored to be here. And I'm so happy to be moderating this panel on the Scarlet Woman in Western Esotericism and the Artistic Occulture from the Fin-de-Siècle until today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Manon Hedenborg. I'm a historian of religion, currently based at Karlstad University as a senior lecturer, and I am the co-convener and co-curator of this exhibition. And we're having a very busy, very wonderful opening weekend here in the Vienne region of France. It's been very kind of full on. We've opened the gallery and one of the satellite venues, the Chateau Moreau, yesterday. And this morning we had a lecture in French by Bruno Fonchereau on the Divine Feminine, which was very successful, and we're very happy with that as well. So thank you again so much for joining us for what I am sure is going to be an hour of illumination and exploration with these three wonderful guests who very generously joined us here today on a Sunday to share their expert knowledge on the intersection of Western esotericism and creativity, where they all work in different ways. So a technical note, we are going to keep the chat open throughout. So for our Zoom audience, if at any point you want to ask a question, you are more than welcome to input that into the chat as it occurs to you. This discussion is going to go for about an hour. I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists very shortly. And at the end, we're going to take a few minutes for questions from the Zoom audience, and if there are any questions from the live audience as well. So we're going to leave that for the end, but you're more than welcome to put your questions in the chat throughout. So without further ado, I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, and I'm going to do this in reverse alphabetical order just to spice things up slightly. So the first guest that I have the very great honor of introducing is Margaret Haines. Margaret is an artist and filmmaker based in Los Angeles and Amsterdam. She's a recent resident of the Rijksacademie van Beeldende Kunsten. Her work has been presented at the East End Film Festival, Carol Fletcher, Auto Italia Southeast, and the ICA in London, 1646 in The Hague, Visio lo schermo dell'arte, Florence, Human Resources Unlimited in Los Angeles, Spazi Murate Bari, Italy, and Western Front Exhibitions, Vancouver. Haines's forthcoming book, On Air, Purity, Corruption and Pollution, is a narrative biography of Marjorie Cameron and pairs Haines's formal archival work with a wider analysis of the contemporary moment and an alignment with the tangential and apophenic. Haines is the author of Love with Stranger ex Coco, published by New Byzantium in 2012, which includes a discussion of Cameron and her work. She has been a board member of the Cameron Parsons Foundation since 2014. I was in 2014 when I was working in LA, then doing some field work and working on my PhD dissertation. And I met Margaret just before the Cameron retrospective that was happening at MoCA in LA in 2014. And she's just an amazing, fabulous, really exciting, creative visionary. And I'm so happy that you're here with us today, Margaret. So The second person that I'm going to be introducing is Sólveig Guðmundsdóttir, who's a researcher, a lecturer, and a translator living and working in Vienna. She recently completed her doctoral dissertation, which examines esotericism and its subversive application in the works of the Viennese actionists. The thesis furthermore concentrates on the intricate discursive entanglements between esotericism and other discourses within the aesthetic project of actionism, such as gender, psychoanalysis, pornography, and fascism. Sólveig is a member of the collective Format, with whom she has curated and organized exhibitions and events. Her research interests and areas of expertise include the historical avant-garde and neo-avant-garde, gender and feminism, modern esotericism, futurity in art, and intersections between technology, society, and art. The first time that I met Sólveig was at the 2017 ESWE conference in Erfurt, and I actually remember this very distinctly because I wasn't able to attend your paper, and it collided with the session that I was in, and no one came to my session because everyone wanted to go to Sólveig's session because Sólveig was speaking on esotericism and pornography, which of course was much more interesting to everyone than whatever boring thing I was talking about. So I was very disappointed then, but I'm so happy that you're here today and that you can share your knowledge with us. So I'm absolutely delighted. So finally, Henrik Bogdan is our third guest here today, and he is a professor of religious studies at the University of Gothenburg. His main areas of research are Western esotericism, new religious movements, and Freemasonry. He's the author of Western Esotericism and Rituals of Initiation, published by State University of New York Press in 2007, the editor of Brother Curwen, Brother Crowley, a correspondence by Aleister Crowley and David Cohen, published by Teton Press in 2010, Aleister Crowley and Western Esotericism, published by Oxford University Press in 2012, Occultism and a Global Perspective, published by Acumen and Routledge in 2013, Sexuality and New Religious Movements, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2014, The Handbook of Freemasonry, published by Brill in 2014, Kenneth Grant, a bibliography, published by Starfire in 2015, Western Esotericism in Scandinavia, published by Brill in 2016, Servants of the Star and the Snake, Essays in Honor of Kenneth and Steffi Grant, published by Starfire in 2018, etc. He is the editor of the Oxford Studies in Western Esotericism book series, which is a fabulous series, and I'm slightly biased because my book was published in that series. So obviously it's very good. And he's also the co-editor of the Palgrave Studies in New and Alternative Religions and secretary of the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism, also known as ESWE. And I might also mention in connection with this particular event that Henrik and I are currently working on an annotated edition of the magical diaries of one of the most important historical Scarlet Women, the Swiss-American school teacher Leah Hersig, whom I spoke about briefly last night. And this is going to be published by Oxford University Press as well. So thank you so much for being here. And let's have a virtual and physical round of applause for this amazing panel. All right, so I'd like to get started by asking each of you to talk a little bit about how you approach this theme of the Scarlet Woman and of sexuality and esotericism. So, of course, for me, we can't really have this discussion without beginning somehow with Aleister Crowley, who was, of course, the first to take this negative biblical figure of the Scarlet Woman and rework it in a positive light as a figure of religious reverence and admiration. And I think this is also especially interesting in connection with today's theme, given that Crowley was, of course, also an artist and a poet. And arguably those things that they can't really be separated out from his work as a magus and an occultist. So I'm going to hand the ball over to Henrik and say, because you're one of the world's foremost academic experts on Crowley and Thelema, so I was wondering, would you like to speak a little bit to the nexus of sex and creativity and gnosis in Crowley's work?
Sure. I prepared a short introductory, a few remarks here. And as I was, first of all, thanks Manon and Sally for the invitation to be here. It's really, I'm looking forward to this discussion. It's a great lineup here with very interesting people. So I look forward to see where we're going to end in this discussion. But anyway, so I prepared a short, some thoughts on this topic then. And I'm going to simply share my screen. I'm going to show a short presentation. I'm going to talk about 5 minutes. I'm going to do something which we as scholars are not supposed to do. I'm going to simplify things very, very much. So I'm going to give a very, very short, simplified introduction to the study of Western esotericists, with a particular focus on what I think is important for today's theme, that is sexuality and artistic expression and transformative experiences. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So not so much on Crowley. I'm going to talk about Crowley perhaps in the discussion later. So let's see if I share my screen here. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. Great. Okay then, so I'm going to give a very short introduction to a very complicated field. And the study of Western esotericists then is a relatively new field, as I'm sure most of you know. It's really started in the early 1990s. And has developed into one of the most exciting fields in religious studies, but also outside of religious studies. History of ideas, theology, Zionist new religious movements, art, sexuality, and so on. And so how should we understand this field then? What is it all about? So in its most simplified meaning then, we can say that esoteric can be seen as standing in contrast to exoteric. So if we look at it from the perspective of religious studies, we can say that all religions, as far as we know, has been divided into an exoteric aspect of the religious tradition, that is the form of religion that most people take part of. And then we have those who claim that there is also an inner aspect of the religion, a secret aspect, the esoteric aspect, which is only reserved for the initiates, people who are spiritually advanced enough to take part of this inner meaning. And we can find this in various ways in Hinduism and Buddhism, in form of Tantra. We can find this in Islamic world in form of Sufism, for instance, and we can find this in Judaism in form of Kabbalah, and so on. And in a Western context then, whatever that might be, that's also a hot topic to discuss, the Western aspect of Western esotericism. We can find a wide range of currents, practices and traditions that we study. And within our field then, we study everything from late antiquity, Gnosticism, and then Hermeticism of the Renaissance and onwards, Christian Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, alchemy, astrology, magic, occultism, modern witchcraft, Thelema, that we're going to talk about today. And these are just a few examples of this huge field that we are studying then. So then one needs to ask the questions, okay, so how can we study this under one term, one umbrella term? And this is where we as scholars, of course, have various approaches. We can look at it as a form of thought, we can look at it as discourse analysis, or various ways of approaching this field then. And I think that for today, one good way of approaching the study of Western esotericism is to look at what sort of knowledge claims can we see as central for most forms of esotericism, especially those that we're going to talk about today, that is 20th century occultism. And here I think it's a good way to understand this is to look at, again, very simplified, what are the two most significant ways to knowledge in Western culture? This is something that scholars have been emphasizing time and time again, but I'd like to mention this because on the one hand we have Greek rationality that leads to the scientific worldview, and this is a type of knowledge that is communicable and verifiable. So I can tell you that I'm drinking coffee here, and if you were here, you would be able to verify if that's coffee or not, in a very simplified way. Dogmatic faith, on the other hand, as expressed in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, is also a form of knowledge that is communicable, but it's not verifiable. So Jesus died on the cross for our sins. I can communicate that, but we cannot verify that. It's a matter of belief. what we are studying then, Western esotericists, can be seen as a third type of knowledge. It's a type of knowledge that is somewhere between rationality and religion, first of all. But more interesting, when we look at the central knowledge claims in this tradition, we can see that it's a form of knowledge that is non-communicable and non-verifiable. And that sounds strange, right? Knowledge that we cannot communicate. What sort of knowledge is that? So here we come to what I think is important for today's discussion then. And that is the concept of gnosis or experiential knowledge. That is that for many of the currents that we are studying, it is the experience of something that is the central secret, which is the central goal. And I think that the best way to understand this is to look at mystical experiences and the literature about mystical experiences. Mystical experiences is something that people have had throughout history and still continue to have in a religious context, but also outside of a religious context. And what is common between all these accounts of mystical experiences is the problems of trying to express this in words. So when you had mystical experiences, when you try to express that, you reduce that experience. And that experience, furthermore, is often seen as transformative. You suddenly realize that you're part of something larger, or that you have a deeper understanding of something, or whatever that might be. And this is, I think this is fascinating, because usually these types of knowledge are also associated with secrecy. So from my own research, for instance, in terms of Freemasonry and rituals of initiation, the rituals are secret because they are centered around experience of undergoing those rituals. And we can talk more about this later. But in terms then of our topic today, of Thelema, and gnosis and sexuality, we can see that these types of experiences then are central not only for Babylon, but also for the magical system that Aleister Crowley created. So for Crowley then, it was essential to discover who you are, your true will, your true essence. And this you would do, according to Crowley, by undergoing a magical discipline, by joining one of his societies perhaps, the AA in particular. And here he describes that there are critical experiences that one needs to undergo in order to discover who you are as a person, and then act according to this. The knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, and the crossing of the abyss, which is connected to Babylon. But I think that the interesting thing here is then also to remember, and this is my final point before these 5 minutes are over here, I think it's important to remember that, so where do we derive our knowledge about Babylon? Where does it come from in terms of Crowley's system? Well, it comes from Crowley's experiences in the desert. So he had these mystical experiences fueled by sexuality. And for Crowley, of course, sexuality was seen as an energy that could be used as a catalyst for having these transformative experiences. And out there in the desert, he explored an Enochian system of magic, a particular form of magic, where he traveled into an astral realm or aethers. And here he received knowledge about Babylon. And that knowledge later he incorporated into the understanding that we have today of what Babylon is all about. That is, as a goddess of femininity and of sexuality. And I think that this is one of the reasons, perhaps also, why many artists have been interested in occultism, and that is that the transformative experience deals with creativity, deals with expressing who you are and exploring who you are. And yeah, so this is something hopefully that we're going to return to in our discussion. And yeah, I think I should end there. I see Manon is getting worried I'm going to talk too long, so I'm ending here. So I'm stopping my share here.
Thank you so much for that, Henrik. I think that was absolutely marvelous, and that's a perfect starting point for the topics that we're going to be discussing today, I think, as well. So we're going to now be moving from the larger picture of esotericism and gnosis and secrecy to a very concrete example of an occult artist who was very much working in this tradition and drawing upon her own mystical and very transformative experiences as a creative wellspring for her artistic practice. So I'm going to hand the ball over now to Margaret Haines, and because you've been working on this research now around Marjorie Cameron for many, many years, and you're now working on a forthcoming narrative biography on Cameron, and this is just incredible research, I think. And I was wondering whether you'd like to share a little bit of what you've been working on.
Yeah, thank you, Manon, and thank you, Henrik, for the slideshow and beginning. Yeah, my understanding of the Scarlet Woman comes from Cameron, and I think Cameron's understanding of, maybe before I go into her a little bit or the writing from the book, I'll just do a very brief biography of Cameron, because I'm not sure if many people know, or I'm sure everyone knows who she is here, but in case. So she was born in 1922 in Iowa. In 1945, after being in the Navy as a draftsperson, she moved to Los Angeles and met Jack Parsons, where she was part of the Babylon Working, and they subsequently married in October of 1946, and she was with him as his wife until his death in 1952, but during that time she traveled to Mexico and to Paris, specifically to go to art school or to kind of perfect her vision or work as an artist. Throughout her life, she influenced a lot of younger artists, including Diane de Prima, Aya Tarlow, Dennis Hopper, George Erms, Wallace Berman, and also Kenneth Anger, where she played Callie in Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. And she lived in Los Angeles for her entire life, with maybe brief trips to Florida and New Mexico. And she died in 1995. So just before I go into the writing as well, I think Cameron's understanding of the Scarlet Woman was uniquely her own, and I think her understanding of Crowley and Thelema, she wasn't part of the OTO, and I think her interpretation centered on kind of a reinterpretation of Parsons' understanding of Crowley, and then a reinterpretation of Crowley, and also then her own experiences, and kind of transcendental Americanism almost. So it was an amalgamation of many things, and it was a very active and disciplined practice. But with regards to the Scarlet Woman, which I've always kind of found interesting, is that I think for her, it was uniquely her own. And although it was maybe an archetype, it wasn't something that, it's not something that can be manifested in anyone. And I think it's pretty clear throughout her writing that it was her, she was like the carrier of this power. And specifically with regards to the experience of the Babylon Working, I think the idea was kind of, I'm still trying to understand this, and maybe this panel will help as well, but it was like that magic happened to her. It didn't happen to me, it didn't happen to you, it was hers. And so there's this force somehow with regards to the Scarlet Woman and Cameron that is, I don't know, bound kind of magnetically in her, I don't know. So that's something I wanted to maybe just discuss and then or bring up at the beginning of this talk. And then when you wrote to me, Manon, to take part in the panel, I was editing the book and going back through all of the chapters, and the first chapter kind of deals with the idea of her birth, and her birth being kind of a divine birth. So maybe I'll just read just very quickly, like 100 words from the writing, and maybe that will give a little bit of an understanding of the scope or the kind of writing it is, because it's not, yeah, it's a narrative, it's like a story. So, so I'll just start now. So it's written in sections. So this is called Doubling. The Cefalù birth was full of beauty, light, red, a burst of joy. The Iowa birth was pinkish, full of flesh, and felt like a throbbing coiled brain, a headache. She tried her whole life to get the Iowa birth out of gray matter and into the light. And in many ways, she succeeded. But for a young child, this doubling was very, very, very hard. The only way the town and her family recognized the doubling was through institutional congratulations and accomplishments, trophies, calling her an artist. She beamed Cefalù to stomach America. Cefalù and Belplane. She wasn't sure if reconciliation ever came between the two spaces of her birth, if ever the union came later, when she was older and understood and wrote. So this is from September 12, 1992, from her diary. I was born at the World Well in the heartland of America on a stormy April day. As the sun went down in flaming glory, I breathed, and far across the world in Sicily, my godfather gazed upon the setting sun and sent forth his word to my birth. And my godmother trembled in a cage by that southern sea. What memories she called forth from ancient shores of Greece and Egypt and Spain. And I'm just gonna skip ahead. Jane's vision. 2 days before Cameron's birth, Jane records, this is Jane Wolfe, I'm skipping around a bit. Jane records a vision in her Cefalù diary. She catches the glow of the descent of the ring of a kind of fire elemental floating from outer space past the South Pole, Libya, then Cefalù, on its way to Iowa, taking stock of the atmospheric conflicts, dangers, solutions, and cures, curled notations of the ride west. April 20th, 1922, AM, 7:45, vision. So then I'm going to skip ahead a little bit more because VA hospital. In 1995, when her interviewers try to parse her life and upbringing into manageable steps like birth, childhood, hopes, dreams, aspirations, she throws them a bone, a real one here, much on this as you try and develop an understanding of a divine birth yet untold. A long pause, and then she lances categorical A to Z pragmatic on her deathbed, for the record, last chance, beginning with C. So I'll just read a little bit and then end of this interview with Cameron, where she a little bit goes into her relationship with Crowley and Jane Wolfe and the Scarlet Woman. See, I've always considered Crowley my magical father, and he was at that time in Sicily with Jane Wolfe, who was a star of the silent screen, who had gone there as a student, and he was trying to humiliate her from her. So this goes a little bit more into, I've always considered them my magical parents. She's talking about Jane, has became my mentor after my husband died. In fact, I met her at the time of the Babylon working. She came and she seemed to be she was kind of an informant that told Crowley what was going on and everything. And after my husband died and I went into the desert, I contacted her. I just intuitively contacted her, and she became my mentor. The interviewer asks, where was she? In Hollywood. The interviewer laughs, well, isn't everyone? And Cameron says, and so she was the only one who had communication with me during that time and reported to them what was going on, that I was really the carrier of this power, the Scarlet Woman. So that's kind of cutting up a lot of the text into small bits to kind of make digestible the beginning of her, like this understanding that her birth was this divine, like that it happened when they were in Cefalù, and she always kind of considered, as she read Crowley, the coincidence of her birth and them in Cefalù, and then the Babylon and her understanding of herself as a Scarlet Woman. So I'll just leave it at that for now. I hope that's not too long.
That's really, really wonderful, Margaret. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think I'm not only speaking for myself when I'm saying I can't wait for the opportunity to read your book. And I just think this is a really, really important contribution. And we'll get back to Cameron, I'm sure, but I'm just, I think it's absolutely marvelous, this growing recognition of her work, which I know that you have a really large part in as well.
Yeah, it's great. She deserves it. So
yeah, and so I think I'm going to move on, and we're going to move to a slightly broader view again. So moving slightly from the topic of Cameron, of course, who was someone who also kept much of her work in relative obscurity for large parts of her life, and we'll get back to that, I think, in a little bit. But turning to you, Sólveig, you are someone, your PhD dissertation was on the Viennese Actionists. So you were working on a collection of artists who've integrated esoteric themes in their work. And for them, of course, this theme of provocation and transgression, I think, was something that they very deliberately sought after, and which was very much intentional, whereas maybe that wasn't always the case for an artist like Cameron. But Sólveig, would you be willing to speak a little bit to your work on these currents and this kind of art, esotericism, transgression triangle?
Yes, of course. Yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be a part of the panel, and thank you for your great introduction, Manon. Also great to hear from you, Henrik and Margaret. Good to have like this different points of departure for our talk for today. I mean, my positioning, I'm coming from the field of literature and art and cultural studies. As Manon just said, I have been researching the Vienna Actionists from the past years. For those who are not familiar with the group, they were an Austrian neo-avant-garde group, mostly active in the 60s and 70s. And they are well known for their very infamous transgressive performance art, which included sexual acts, animal cadavers, blood, bodily fluids, and all manner of things that were quite radical at that time. My focus point in my thesis is how they drew on esoteric traditions, which was often in a very subversive manner. They utilized esotericism as a counter narrative, and yes, for example, when dealing with gender and sexuality. There was very drawing from very various traditions such as alchemy, shamanism, New Age, and therefore also Eastern traditions. And the myth of the Black Mass was also another point of interaction. And one moment. Yeah, and what I wanted to return to and what is important in the context of this discussion is gender and sexuality was a really big part of their work and its intersection with the esoteric. For this, they adopted from various traditions and esoteric motives. They use the symbolic language of alchemy, the figure of the shaman as an androgynous figure to counteract traditional masculinity, for example, the hermaphrodite, and various images of masculine virility that comes from different traditions as well. Another factor was also that the female form was very important in many of their ritual performances, especially in the case of Haines, who very much played with this idea of sacred sexuality and put the female usually often at the center of his performances. So they deal with the topic of gender and sexuality and esotericism in a very very different manner, which is also very interesting. Even as a collective, they do go in various directions. And what I did also want to was to mention that there, because of your talk also, Henrik, because you were talking about this transformative experience and creativity, as a connection with the creativity for the actionists, their performance, or what they call the action, they thought of it as also as a transformative action that could cause catharsis and like abstraction in the audience and for the artist as well. So for that, they were using both esoteric and psychoanalytic theory to conceive of that transformative art form, which is very fascinating to examine. Yeah. Yeah, to come to a close, this is the kind of the point, my point of departure, and I do I do also see a lot of this similar thread of these transgressive sexualities and femininities that come up in their performances, that is parallel to the Scarlet Woman and how she is also portrayed in art. And I'm also very excited to hear more from Margaret about the figure of Margaret Cameron, for example, because I find her very fascinating as someone who was both an artist and practitioner as well, something that is also very common. You can't always separate the two. And the artworks can also be a big part of esoteric practice as well. So yeah, I'll leave you with that.
Thank you so much for that, Sólveig. That's a really great starting point for where we're going from here as well. I just want to thank you all for these phenomenal introductions, and I want to start by jumping off the point that Henrik made with the difference between the esoteric and the exoteric. So when we were planning this exhibition, we had an open call for submissions, and we received a very strong response and very sort of passionate reactions to this topic of the Scarlet Woman from all corners of the world and from all different kinds of creatives and artists basically working with this theme in different ways. And some of these artists had a very strong connection to more kind of formalized forms of esotericism, and others less so. And you can see that in the different works that are part of the exhibition. So for instance, Luciana Lupe Vasconcelos, who is here with us here today in the audience, who works kind of within a surrealist context maybe, and draws a lot of inspiration from Margaret Cameron. I know that she is very important to Lupe as a source of inspiration. And if we look at the work of Bint al-Shalabiya, for instance, whose audiovisual installation for the women girt with a sword draws very strongly on the work of Parsons and Cameron, and also of Crowley. So there's a very strong connection to that esoteric tradition. But then we also have completely different works of art which come out of very different contexts. And I think this is a really interesting mix of different works. So is the Scarlet Woman, is she branching out? Is she becoming exoteric in a sense, is what I'm wondering. Is she moving outside of this kind of very secret, very niche, very sort of selected, exclusive knowledge, and why is she moving beyond this kind of exclusive esoteric context, and what is it that makes this symbol broadly interesting or engaging for artists or esotericists today?
So who should start?
You can start.
Okay, I'll start, and I will see where it leads to. I think that you're absolutely right. First of all, that Babylon is becoming exoteric more than esoteric, in the sense that she has really entered popular culture. And I think that that's one way of looking at it, and to see the way that esotericism has become part of popular culture, or occulture, as Christopher Partridge would call it. And I think that to a large extent, the Babylon, of course, is associated with Aleister Crowley, and Aleister Crowley has become an icon in popular culture today. So he's somebody that many people know about, and have rather, all kinds of understandings about him. And he pops up in all manner of different contexts. And I think that the popularity of Crowley and the symbolism connected to Crowley, and in particular his tarot cards, the Thoth deck, has been almost disconnected with the esoteric tradition and become exoteric, as you call it. And I think that that's one reason why Babylon also has become such not common, I think that would be to overstate it, but has become more mainstream than she was during Crowley's time. So that's part of it. The other part of it, I think also that Babylon speaks to many of the issues that people see as relevant today. I mean, the concept of sexuality, liberation, and female sexuality. I think that's something that we can see in all manner of aspects in the art world, in esotericism, and all kinds of esoteric movements and so on. So I think that she's really a good symbol for that, an archetype, as Margaret Cameron would have called it. And I think that's, yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking with what you were saying, Margaret, if we take this idea of kind of Crowley and esotericism and Babylon sort of moving into the mainstream or moving into the esoteric, how do you think that Cameron would have felt about that? Because she was someone who chose kind of to work in a more sort of personal way and to not share everything that she did with a broader audience. What are your thoughts?
I know when you brought up this question, or I was thinking, just to cycle back a little bit, and then I'll answer specifically with regards to Cameron. I mean, I was thinking of the early or the second wave feminists like Hannah Wilke and Carolee Schneemann, and I don't really know if I almost feel like as if the sexual liberation movement and also the early kind of feminist performance artists were already working in this vein, and I almost feel like it's one label that can be already attached to the work of creative or of artists, and particularly like women feminist artists. So I don't necessarily know if it's what is kind of coming first, if that makes sense. No, it's not entirely articulate. With regards to Cameron, one thing that comes to mind is that in the 70s, she was really working towards liberating women. She was reading Woman and Superwoman on the radio. She had met Kate Millett, who wrote Sexual Politics, through her friend Cynthia McAdams. So she, I think, would have rejoiced somehow even though she felt kind of an attachment that was particularly hers. I think she definitely would have rejoiced in the proliferation of Babylon or Babylon-like aesthetics or transgressive behavior. I think I don't think she would have balked at it or anything. If that makes sense. Maybe I'll think a little bit more about it as the conversation continues.
And that's really, I really love that you brought up Woman and Superwoman, and I didn't know that you met Kate Millett also. That's really fascinating.
There's beautiful photographs of them together, and I think they had a correspondence mostly through Cynthia, who was Kate Millett's girlfriend for quite a long time. So and she were, and one of the longest interviews we have with her is from Woman House in Los Angeles at the railroad station. So she's talking about, I think the 70s for her in terms of the women's movement was really an exciting time, because I think it was incredibly difficult for her to be who she was, and not only as just as a woman, but also as an artist in the 50s and 40s, and as a teenager, like heartbreakingly difficult, So I think would have just been, it's just, I think, very beautiful to her that there's a possibility for women to perform and work as they are now.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I think as we've had this open call as well for artists and submissions, one of the things that we asked for people to submit, which many of them did, was these questionnaires on how they envision the Scarlet Woman and how they relate to this idea. And we had some very, very personal, very sort of intimate, emotional stories that were generated from that, and we'll see what we can do with that material down the line as well. But I think that this is really important to a lot of people in different ways. Sólveig, I was wondering, this just kind of bouncing off of what we're talking about here with transgression and provocation, like the importance of that. Is there, you know, one of the things that I'm wondering as we've been working on putting together this exhibition is that it's been very, very easy in some ways in terms of kind of public support. We have the support of the Département de Vienne, for instance, where we're at right now to construct a Scarlet Trail through the region. Madame la Maire of La Trimouille was here last night at the center of the village at the cafe, wearing red, being supportive and being very positive and very helpful. And it's all been very smooth. Whereas the Vienna Actionists, for instance, I know that several of them served jail time for the artworks that they were doing. And of course, Cameron's work was literally torn off the wall by LAPD when it was shown at Fear's Gallery. And if we look at someone like Rosaline Norton, for instance, she was prosecuted for obscenity. And Crowley, in terms of Crowley, his poem for a Scarlet Woman, Leia Herzig, Leia Sublime, that was considered so obscene that a case that it was being transported in from continental Europe to England was confiscated by customs. And we've had none of that. We've had no one trying to pull the art off the walls or derail the exhibition in any way. We've not had any angry townspeople with pitchforks or torches or anything. And of course, we're very thankful for that. We're very happy about that. But what I'm wondering is there anything that is lost in that? Have we arrived at a place where these themes of gender and carnality and physicality and sexuality and the Scarlet Woman, for instance, where that's just no longer transgressive or provocative? Is that where we are? Are we so surrounded by images of nudity and sexuality that we're all a bit blasé with these things now? And do you think something is lost along the way? Is there a value in provocation?
This is hard. Like art and transgression have long gone together, especially in the avant-garde, and with the Vienna Actionists, that was, of course, with the context of the time. They were, like you said, they were jailed and arrested multiple times for different charges, often obscenity or pornography, also for offending the Catholic Church. I have been, this is something I have thought about, and I think we are not out of reach of transgression, but with time and within different cultural contexts, these borders, they change and move. And the question is, what would we see as transgressive today? And thankfully, things are not as dire as in Crowley times or in the 50s, for example. But it is still. It is still not always completely depending on the gendered body or the identity of the people. Not everyone is awarded the same freedom, and there are also, because we're talking here, for example, about the feminine and feminine sexual, that is, for example, not always attached to biologically female body. And that is something that sadly in many areas and many places is still considered transgressive. So I think this is something that's always, you always have to contextualize and think about the socio-political and historical and cultural context. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can deliver a completely clear answer. This is, yeah, this is a good question to contemplate, but I find it hard to maybe give the final word on it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's a big question, and it's something that I'm really grappling with myself a little bit now. Henrik, I'm sure you'd like to jump in here.
Yeah. Well, to a certain extent, one can say that, of course, sexuality and religion is much more, the combination is much more accepted today than it was during Crowley's time. That was provocative to combine sexuality with some sort of religious aspirations. Now with Tantra and the sacred sexuality, that seems to be almost mainstream today. Having said that, I think it's also important to remember that there's a new moralism on the rise. Only last week, Swedish artist Anna von Hauswolf was cancelled in France for giving her performing a concert by fundamentalist Catholics to claim that her music was satanic. Or just look at social media, that we can't even show classical art anymore on Facebook or Instagram because it might show a nipple or something like that. So, I mean, it's a really paradoxical situation. On the one hand, we are blasé, but on the other hand, there's an extreme moralism and intolerance coming not only from religious quarters, but also from secular quarters. So I think that, we will see new art forms dealing with this, activists perhaps, on social media and so on, and that's probably already going on here. I'm not an art expert, but I would imagine that there's going to be a reaction against this new moralism in terms of transgression also. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and definitely I was thinking about that example of Anna von Hauswolf as well, because I think that ties into I think what these people in this village reacted to, these fundamentalist Catholics, was basically that she'd written a song about making love to the devil or something like that. So it directly ties into this whole discussion as well. Margaret, I'm thinking about this in relation to Cameron, of course, being someone who was very much a victim of this kind of public censorship. What effect did that have on her as a thinker, as an artist?
She was, just to go back, you mentioned that her work was censored from, it was, just to give a little bit of context. So this was an exhibition by Wallace Berman at Ferris Gallery in 1956. And he had placed an image of a male and female genitalia copulating as part of his assemblage work. And then he had put Cameron on the cover of his magazine Semina. And so her drawing, Peyote Vision, which maybe many of you have probably seen, which is like a sexual act in a drawing of a sexual act. I mean, and so it was the Vice Squad was called in, and there's always kind of been this contemplation on her, and that it wasn't really even that they came in by their own, but it was almost the gallery called so she almost felt like framed almost by the art world to kind of create a sensationalist exhibition. So almost as if the censorship had been, contrived. And, but in any case, her work was taken off the wall and Wallace Berman's wasn't, and the drawing Peyote Vision, and there was a censorship case that happened around the same time Howell was undergoing sorry, I'm just reading this text from Sally. And I think she didn't have, after Parsons' death, I think she had no tolerance or no ability to kind of stomach anything that would hurt kind of the world that she had created in order for her to perform and create as she wanted to, or live her life as she wanted to. And so she saw that censorship trial, whether it was from the actual Vice Squad or from the gallery, as incredibly like an incredible puncture, and she stopped showing in galleries and stopped showing her work in a professional context. So I always think she could have had more of a career than she had during her lifetime. So she kind of dropped out as a result of the censorship of that work. So in some ways you could say it silenced her. On the other hand, it also allowed her to work as an artist without the gallery context or without selling her work, and work with her work is kind of part of a ritualistic practice as opposed to having it act as a commodity. So I think, I mean, she was fiercely independent before that happened, and I think that it wasn't really much of a, it affected her, but I don't think it had affected her independence somehow, because that was always kind of a stalwart within the practice. So I don't know if I'm entirely answering your question.
No.
With regards to, just to go, the question is more with regards to, can you just repeat it so that I can, sorry.
It's kind of the effect, but I think you are answering it, the effect that this sort of censorship or silencing had on Cameron as a creative and on her vision, basically. Yeah, and I think she was, thank you, I think she was censored. That's kind of a moment of censorship that is on the record, but I think there were countless moments of censorship. She was accused of witchcraft when she was in Mexico. And hunted down by the Catholic Church there. So I think, and also just as a child as well, I think there was just, I think it almost formed her, the form of censorship she had to undergo. And in terms of what Henrik was saying, that there's a new moralism happening or a new conservatism happening as a result of kind of more accepted transgressive artistic practices. I think that it's almost like this seesaw that happens. So you'll have like this transgression that happens and then the conservative happen. And I think that also kind of formed Cameron. It was almost like waves kind of forming the crystal. I don't know, it's not like the best metaphor, but I think that she would be transgressive and the conservatism would rise, and then she would go even further to kind of test the waters and back and forth, or kind of see where she could go and have her vision also still protected at the same time. So also that meant also moving around, even though it was just within Los Angeles, like moving from neighborhood to neighborhood as well. Because she wasn't always accepted in the communities where she would settle for a period of time. And she loved, I think she really loved Santa Monica and Genesee, because that was where all the sex theaters were. She really wanted to read her poetry in the Pussycat Theater. So I think, yeah, she finally found her neighborhood. Yeah, that's really, yeah, that's so much there, and just processing here what you just said. I'm thinking this thing that you mentioned of kind of this. I mean, there's two sides to kind of to secrecy in this sense. I guess you could see secrecy in some ways as a necessary response to a culture of cancellation or a culture of censorship, where you have to keep what you're doing secret because it's too explosive and too provocative to really be able to be disseminated to a broader audience. But there's and that could be quite sad and quite bleak in some ways when it's forced upon someone. But it could also, as you say, if I'm interpreting you correctly, it could also be, there could also be some power in that, in the ability to kind of guard and guard your own vision and nourish your own vision without having to exist as a commodity and to immediately enter into the exoteric sphere and market what you're doing. I think this is really interesting in connection to this topic as well, because I'm I realized yesterday when I was giving a talk on this last night, and when I was working on my research about the goddess Babylon and the Scarlet Woman, and some of the interviews that I conducted with people who are Thelemites and people who are devotees of Babylon, I shared some quotes from some of those interviews, and in my head, it's very recent, to be 6 or 7 years since I conducted a lot of those interviews, and a lot has happened in the public perception of these ideas. And one of the things that have happened is this kind of social mediaification of everything that's just accelerating so quickly, and this kind of mushrooming of TikTok and of TikTok occulture and of young occultists and witches who are putting forward these ideas in this very kind of condensed, very mediatized format. And it seems that there's, I don't know, to me, I don't know, this is really just thinking out loud, because I'm kind of grappling with this myself as well. But it seems like today there is much less space to kind of have a more personal vision and a more private vision, whether you're an intellectual or an artist or a creative in any way. And really, I struggle to know what to do with that. It seems that there is a pressure on all of us to kind of self-commodify and to market ourselves really aggressively just to kind of survive in this world. And I wonder if that's always conducive to any kind of vision that's original. That's just an open question there.
Should I respond to this?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in some ways with the commodification, or it's a flattening out that somehow happens. It's not, I don't know if commodification is the right, there's kind of a flattening out or condensation or a simplistic understanding. At the same time, I also applaud, it's kind of this double-edged sword, but it's confusing because it also allows so many people to connect and understand and share their visions. So there's also a utopic understanding to social media as well. I don't know. I feel like we haven't really gone far enough maybe with it to kind of understand exactly how it will manifest. Yeah, but it does kind of turn your stomach sometimes. I understand maybe it's something to think about a little bit longer.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm that's all I have to say at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really interesting. I'm just thinking about all of this now, and time is getting away with us as well, as I just noticed. We've actually passed the 1 hour mark. So I am going to just have a look at the chat here and see there seems to be lots going on. And for some reason, the writing on my screen is teeny tiny. Yeah, maybe we should move along to the questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. And just in advance of that, just to thank all three of you, Henrik, Margaret, and Sólveig as well, so much for being here with us today. And we could obviously talk about this for much longer, I think. And these are just such interesting topics, and it's absolutely marvelous that you're all here with us. And so everyone in the audience, you are very welcome to raise your hand or to put your questions in the chat. I'm just going to read aloud a comment here from Hazel, who's here with us on Zoom today. Whilst there has been much female sexual emancipation in the quote unquote West, at the international level, there is still widespread oppression, female genital mutilation, arranged marriages, women being prohibited from driving in areas of the Middle East, but also closer to home in Europe. The battles of women gaining abortion rights in Northern Ireland taking so long, for example. These discourses of feminine sexual liberation seem still very potent in certain geographical contexts. Western and otherwise. And yes, absolutely, I'd agree with that very, very strongly. And I mean, even just moving to the US, for instance, what's happening now there with reproductive rights, or I mean, I guess one of the big things about a year ago was the reactions, the conservative reactions to the song Wet Ass Pussy by Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B, yeah? Yeah, okay. and I mean, they're singing about female sexuality and female sexual pleasure. And one of these most conservative voices in that kind of media landscape was saying, you know, I find this very abnormal and very strange. And I spoke to my wife, she's a medical doctor, and she says that pussies should not be wet. This seems very irregular. and we're all listening to this going, Ben Shapiro, that's right, Ben Shapiro said this. And it's like, okay, maybe that says more about you, Ben Shapiro. But so this is definitely a very limited sphere of the world, I think, absolutely, where we have the space to do this kind of thing. We have a question here from Andra. Is the Eurocentric Scarlet Woman the opposing polarized construct against the construct of the Eurocentric virtuous white woman, a protected status afforded under white supremacy ideology? Sólveig, I can see you've got your hand raised. Did you want to come in?
Well, I was just going to add to what you were saying earlier from the previous comment, that this point out that this has also been sadly development in Europe. For example, here I'm living in Austria, and there are women coming from Poland who have abortion in Austria because of the new law in Poland. And I think it's in Hungary where they have forbidden gender studies. So this is sadly a development that is happening all over. Yeah. No, I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah.
And this new moralism and new ideology that's coming up in that era.
Yeah, very much so.
I think in response to Andra's question, yes, it is a very white, very European phenomenon. It's based largely in Europe and the USA, or has been traditionally, and it's moving out. But the archetype of the feminine powerful, which has been monopolized by white female, as a huge generalization, but truly, sadly, it has shifted to me, because we've talked about her sexuality and the taboos around sex, but for me it's always a taboo around power and how that's skewed. And artists like Jeff Koons, Warhol, Basquiat commodified sexuality really well and effectively in the art markets and did that. So you have Cameron working in a much more ritualistic way. And what I'm seeing in the last 2 years is a lot of women working in film, video, online, but as eco-arts activists, and in a much more open, much more multicultural way. So that divine feminine Scarlet Woman, transgressive, counter-political, activist role has gone towards an environmental and eco-arts. That's where it's moved to. That's where so much work is being made, as opposed to esoteric work. So again, that esoteric-exoteric shift has been made. And in the last 18 months, we have seen a big push to include much more non-white, non-European artworks in those spaces. But yes, we have monopolized them. Yeah.
We have a question from Caleb in the chat. From Crowley and Jung to TikTok, the rate of content creating and everything is out of control and processed so differently. The input/output of women artists and the feminine voice, however, seems to have much more platforms and acceptance. Which goes back to.
And it depends again on whether you consider, and there's generational aspects to this, certainly with attitudes towards sexuality, pornography, marriage, relationship, gender, but also access to power. So everyone under 30 is using TikTok, is using the dark web, or dipping in and out of it, whereas and perhaps the whole generation
Definitely
of over 70s.
Under 30. I'm 31 and I do not. I feel way out of my depth.
But again, there's a whole range of senior citizens. A whole range of senior citizens who are also accessing the web suddenly. But we're kind of living in lots of little silos in that way. So it's interesting. We have much more information and much more freedom, but we're all contained by paradigms. And I think we need to address how self-created those are and how we can bridge those as women.
Yeah. We have a question here from Leo Jacobi. Does personal experience and self-expression become art when shared in a gallery and the commentary starts? Is esoteric moving to exoteric a typical process of private experience becoming social? Dogma constructed rational discourse of revelation in a community who is steward and patron of experience of its members. And I just want to start by phrasing that question to our panelists. Do either of you want to jump in with an answer to that?
Well, I think that Sólveig and Margaret probably have much more to say about that, since you are more in the art world than I am. But my immediate reaction, without having thought about it too clearly, is no. I don't think that just because it's an esoteric artwork is being hung up in a gallery, it's become less esoteric. I don't think so at all. Because why do I think so? Well, I think first of all we need to define what is esoteric art. Is it the process leading to the artwork, or is it the symbolism being used, or is it the combination, or is it in the eye of the beholder? Or so how do we define what is esoteric art? But let's take somebody who, like Austin Osman Spare or Steffi Grant, that I have written a little bit about. And of course, Steffi's art, and I showed that image of the invocation of fire snake here in my slide, the last image there. Her artwork was never exhibited in any galleries, but it was published in books. And of course, thereby it became accessible and exoteric in the sense that people could see the artwork. But to me, it's still, of course, it's an expression, we know that, of her personal experiences. She tried to bring down into an art form what she had experienced, and also the tradition that she was working in and the symbols that she was working in. She tried to visualize those. And to me, that's still esoteric art, even though it's published, or even though she in the future will be exhibited in galleries.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, this is also what I mentioned just shortly at the beginning. There is not always, like with Margaret Cameron, the artist can also be a practitioner, and the entanglement between esotericism and art is very interesting in general, and often hard to, how do you say it? How do we measure this? What is esoteric art? You have artists like the Actionists who most of them were not strictly esoteric practitioners, although in the case of Rudolf Schwarzkopf, who really went deep into studying New Age doctrine and Eastern spirituality, and did his own and develop his own revolutionary lifestyle in accordance. Still, the Actionists as a group weren't an esoteric group, but they infused their art with the esoteric. And then there are artists that are practitioners, and how I find to go on a tangent a bit, I find it also interesting, like this question of if it is in the public, is it no longer esoteric, or like then this concept of the esoteric always being hidden or forbidden. I'm not sure if I can come to a good endpoint here. It's just, no, it's a really good question, and something I have also grappled with and tried to, and not just me, other scholars and artists, and try to find where are these boundaries, and maybe these are also boundaries that should be transgressed. And
I would just say, yeah, I don't think if it's publicly shown or publicly exhibited in any way, does that strip any esotericism of a work. And I think even there are artists who are, I think sometimes the act of creation, I guess, is, this is maybe romantic, but is so ineffable that I don't think you can strip it really ever, the esoteric, because I think there's kind of an ineffable or inexplicable space within esotericism in terms of the experiential, as Henrik you spoke about, or the transformative experience. So I think that can, if it's a great work, I guess you can't ever strip that from the work, even if it's shown publicly. Otherwise, it would just be very sad. I don't know if that makes sense somehow.
Yeah, I think I think that's a really lovely point to begin to end on, because we've actually kind of moved back to some extent where we started, to this dividing line between the exoteric and the esoteric, and where that line really is.
I had written a few notes about that, and about artist and shaman, and Crowley and shaman, and the role of popular bard or shaman or fool. And if Crowley fulfills the role of shaman or fool or ritual artist, and certainly ritual is central to art and making. And I think that we have shifted away from a very patriarchal white European dominance of the art world, and that has shifted a bit as well. So a lot more spaces. But the role of the shaman and the role of fool, and shaman is a word that also is very loaded. But the show of ritual performance artist, or also is Crowley a fool? Is of some kind of, and are all artists some kind of shamanic fool as well?
That's a very big question.
Do we have any questions from the floor before?
One about secrecy, if it's okay, which is what it started with to some degree as well. And that Henrik was talking about secrecy as being a position of famous paradigm, if you like, in a sense. And while it's very understandable that secrecies come up in this as people need to guard and harness and get things together and so on, and so on. But he was talking about it as a position. And when you're talking about experiences that are transformative across the universe and very explorative, I was just wondering what he meant by secrecy and why is it a position?
Okay.
I don't know if they can hear.
Could you hear that, or should we repeat it? No. Sally, do you want to?
Our question was about Henrik's opening statement about secrecy being a position within esoteric practice, and could that be expanded on a little?
Sure. Secrecy can be approached from many different perspectives, and from power perspective, that we have something that you don't have, so then we immediately are in a power position, and so on. And we can see that secrecy plays a very important role in many esoteric traditions, in the sense that it is about revealing secrets, or claiming to have secrets, or be initiated into secrets, and so on. And that's one aspect which is fascinating and interesting, and we can say a lot about it. But my point then in the introduction was more the reason from a functional point of view. So why are many of these teachings or practices secret? And I think that the reason for that is that those experiences that we're talking about, that they are so individual, that are so personal, that on the one hand it is difficult to verbalize, to put words on those experiences. And when you do that, you reduce the experience and it becomes superficial. But on the other hand also, that your experiences will have an effect on other people's experiences, if we're talking about an initiatic tradition, for instance, like Freemasonry that I mentioned. There we can see that what is being considered to be secret is not some sort of world-changing knowledge or teachings or doctrine or antisocial doctrine, anything like that. But what is considered secret is the rituals themselves. So why are those rituals secret? Well, they are secret because if you know what's going to happen, it's going to have a negative effect upon your experience of undergoing the ritual. And that's something that the Masons in this case return to time and time again, and something which I encountered when I did my research on Freemasonry. When I wrote my thesis, I got access to rituals that Freemasons would not get access to. Since I was not a Mason, so it didn't matter if I read those rituals. It would have mattered if I had been a Mason. Then I would not get access to those rituals because that would have an effect upon the function. I would know what's going to happen when I was going to undergo those rituals. And I think that says something about secrecy and the function of secrecy for many of these societies, many of these organizations, that it's about experience, and we need to keep that private. So it's secrecy, perhaps is not a good word because we connect it to conspiracies and something dark and something like that, but more privacy then. It's private and inexpressible. We cannot communicate also what's happening here.
So the personal experiential aspect which can't be anticipated.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think this is a really good point to end on, and I just want to reiterate what Margaret said as well, which about the ineffability of the creative process, or the ineffability of certain forms of experiences. And you said that maybe that's a bit romantic, and I think it is, but I really like that as well. I think that's really beautifully put. So on that note, I just want to say thank you again so much to all three of our wonderful panelists for being here with us on a Sunday and sharing your knowledge and sharing your expertise. So I think we can have just another round of applause virtually and on site. Thank you also to everyone who's joined us in the audience and who's asked questions. And I know there are more questions and comments in the chat, but just in the interest of timekeeping, we do have to move forward now. And just before logging out, I just want to hand it over to Sally, who's going to say a few words about what will happen next.
Yeah, and thank you, Manon, as well. It's been wonderful having you here for the weekend. If you have thoughts and responses, do send them, or do keep the lines of communication open, because it's the beginning of the project and we're still working through collating lots of information. And we will have a second closing event, rehang of the work in March. We have other panels in January which look at a wider cultural context of the Scarlet Woman and an older perspective and a linguistic basis as well as those which address contemporary USA arts practice around her. So a really different level. Today's and yesterday's lectures are very focused on Crowley and Scarlet Woman and Babylon and the issues around her. So we are widening it out, and we are aware there are gaps in our expert knowledge, especially around wider cultural issues or comparisons with that. And I always refer to Max Dashu's Suppressed Histories Archive as a brilliant resource to take further with that. As a closing event for this wonderful weekend, Yota, who's with us here in the panel as well, is going to lead a meditation on red, and we're going to open that session at 5 to 4, start at 4. So if we log out now for comfort breaks, and then we can log back in to close that. Does that suit you okay, Yota? Perfect. And again, just a wonderful set of discussions which open up lots more ideas, taking the icon and archetype forward.
Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. See you shortly.